Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never questioned the one door they asked you never to open? My husband told me there was only one room in the basement that stayed locked because it held old furniture. I believed him until the night I heard someone knocking from behind the wall. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Then I heard again 3 slow knocks, followed by a whisper I couldn't understand. For a moment, I froze, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. But when the sound came a third time, something inside me changed. My name is Emily, and for 8 years I believed I was married to the kindest, most dependable man I had ever known. My husband, Ryan, was patient, hardworking, and the kind of neighbor everyone admired. We lived in a quiet American town where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Our life looked ordinary from the outside. And maybe that is exactly why I ignored the small things that never quite made sense. I never imagined that one ordinary night would begin a chain of discoveries that would destroy everything I believed about my marriage. What I found behind that hidden wall destroyed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. Every neighborhood has that one house people quietly wonder about. Sometimes it is because of its age. Sometimes because of the stories that survive long after the people who live there are gone. Our house had been standing for almost 90 years before Ryan bought it. It had changed owners several times, survived storms, renovations, and generations of families whose names had almost disappeared from public memory. To me, it was simply home. To Ryan, it seemed to be something more. Looking back now, I realize he never truly talked about why he chose that particular house. Whenever friends complimented the beautiful property, he would smile politely and change the subject. I thought nothing of it because marriage teaches you that everyone has pieces of their past they prefer to leave behind. The problem begins when those forgotten pieces refuse to stay buried. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because today's story is one that has left investigators, neighbors, and even those closest to the truth asking the same haunting question. What was really hidden beneath that house? This story is inspired by real accounts of hidden rooms, concealed spaces discovered during home renovations, and documented cases in which families uncovered shocking secrets inside properties they believed they knew completely. While names, locations, and certain identifying details have been changed to protect privacy, the emotions, discoveries, and unsettling questions are drawn from situations that have happened to ordinary people. As you listen, remember that some of the most extraordinary mysteries are not found in abandoned mansions or forgotten castles. They are found in homes where people cook dinner together, celebrate birthdays, and believe they know the person sleeping beside them every night. Ryan and Emily looked exactly like that kind of couple. Friends admired them. Neighbors envied them. Family members often described them as the marriage everyone hoped to have someday. Yet hidden beneath years of trust was one locked door, one impossible sound, and one discovery that would leave Emily wondering whether she had ever truly known the man she called her husband. This is where the story really begins. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and realized the warning signs had always been there, hiding in plain sight? That question haunted Emily long after everything had fallen apart, because once the truth finally surfaced, she could trace almost every terrifying discovery back to the day she and Ryan first stepped inside the old colonial house they would eventually call home. It stood at the end of a quiet street in a peaceful American neighborhood where children rode bicycles until sunset and neighbors waved from their front porches without thinking twice about the people living around them. The house had charm that modern homes simply couldn't imitate. Original hardwood floors stretched across nearly every room. Wide windows filled the living spaces with warm afternoon light, and a stone fireplace became the centerpiece of family gatherings during the holidays. Ryan seemed unusually determined to buy it, even when the inspection revealed several expensive repairs that scared away other buyers. Emily remembered asking whether they should keep looking, but Ryan smiled, squeezed her hand, and quietly said that some homes were worth saving because they carried history. At the time, she thought it was a romantic thing to say. She never imagined those words would return to her years later with an entirely different meaning. Their marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm almost immediately. Ryan worked as a commercial architect whose projects often required long hours and occasional overnight trips, while Emily managed a small interior design business that allowed her to work from home several days each week. They laughed often, hosted neighborhood barbecues every summer, and became the kind of couple others admired because they rarely argued in public and always appeared deeply devoted to one another. 8 years passed almost effortlessly. Birthdays came and went. Christmas decorations filled the house every December. Friends celebrated anniversaries with them, never suspecting anything unusual beneath the polished surface of their marriage. Yet there was one part of the house that never became part of Emily's daily life. The basement remained almost entirely Ryan's responsibility. Whenever she offered to organize it or help clean out old boxes, he would gently refuse, saying it was dusty, cluttered, and full of broken furniture left behind by previous owners. His explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Every old house had a forgotten storage area, and Emily had no reason to doubt the man she trusted more than anyone else in the world. Trust, after all, has a way of making ordinary questions seem unnecessary. Still, small moments began collecting in Emily's memory without her realizing they formed a pattern. Ryan always locked the basement door before leaving for work, even when there was no one else in the house. If repair technicians needed access to the furnace or water heater, he insisted on being present himself rather than allowing Emily to let them downstairs. Once, during a power outage, Emily volunteered to grab a flashlight she believed was stored near the basement stairs, but Ryan stopped her almost immediately and retrieved it himself within seconds. He never raised his voice, never acted aggressively, and never appeared frightened. Instead, he always smiled in a calm, reassuring way that made Emily feel almost embarrassed for questioning something so ordinary. Looking back, she realized his greatest strength wasn't convincing people with elaborate lies. It was making them believe there was never any reason to ask questions in the first place. That quiet confidence allowed the locked basement to become just another accepted part of daily life, like the squeaky staircase or the old oak tree in the backyard. Everything remained ordinary until one rainy Thursday evening in late October. Ryan packed a small suitcase for what he described as a 2-day business conference several hours away. Emily kissed him goodbye at the front door, watched his car disappear down the street, and settled in for what she expected would be another peaceful night alone. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while the wind rattled tree branches outside, creating the familiar soundtrack of an autumn storm. She made herself a cup of tea, turned on the television, and tried reading a novel before finally giving up and heading toward bed. Just as she reached the hallway, the house became strangely quiet. The rain softened. The wind eased. Then, from somewhere beneath the floor, came 3 slow knocks. Emily stopped walking. She listened carefully, telling herself it was probably an old pipe expanding from the temperature change. The house was nearly 90 years old. Old houses made strange noises. She laughed nervously, shook her head, and continued toward the bedroom. Then the knocking returned. 3 slow knocks again. This time, they sounded deliberate, almost as though someone wanted to make certain they had been heard. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, every instinct urging her to ignore what she had just heard, yet every heartbeat pulling her toward the basement door. She had no way of knowing that opening that door would begin the most frightening chapter of her life. Emily stood motionless in the hallway, staring at the basement door as another uneasy silence settled over the house. Her heart raced, but she kept reminding herself there had to be a logical explanation. Houses built nearly a century earlier shifted with changes in temperature. Water pipes expanded. Wooden beams creaked. She repeated those explanations in her mind because they were easier to accept than the possibility that someone or something had produced those 3 deliberate knocks. After several minutes, she convinced herself to continue toward the bedroom, but sleep never came. Every small sound seemed louder than usual. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Rainwater trickled through the gutters outside. Branches scraped lightly against the windows. Then, just after midnight, it happened again. 3 slow knocks. This time they were followed by what sounded like a faint voice. Emily couldn't make out the words. It wasn't loud enough to understand, but it was unmistakably different from the ordinary noises of an old house. She sat upright in bed, every instinct telling her that if she ignored it now, she might never forgive herself for not finding out the truth. Grabbing the flashlight from her nightstand, she slowly walked downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The basement smelled exactly as Ryan had always described it: old wood, concrete, dust, and forgotten memories. Shelves lined one wall, stacked with paint cans, holiday decorations, and cardboard boxes that looked as though they hadn't been opened in years. The furnace hummed steadily in the corner, casting a low mechanical vibration through the room. Emily swept the flashlight across every inch of the basement, expecting to find nothing more than shadows. But something immediately caught her attention. One section of the far wall looked different. The paint was newer than the surrounding concrete, slightly smoother, as though someone had carefully covered an older surface. She walked closer and ran her fingers across it. The wall felt unusually cold. She knocked gently with her knuckles. Most of the basement walls produced the solid, heavy sound she expected. This section answered with a dull, hollow echo. Emily stepped back, suddenly aware that the dimensions of the room didn't make sense. She had spent enough years helping clients redesign homes to understand floor plans. The basement should have extended farther beneath the house than what she was seeing. There was missing space that simply shouldn't have disappeared. Trying to calm herself, Emily searched the shelves for anything that might explain the strange construction. Hidden behind a row of dusty storage bins, she discovered an old metal filing cabinet she had never noticed before. Its drawers were stiff from years of neglect, but eventually one slid open with a loud scrape. Inside were faded receipts, warranty papers for appliances that had long since been replaced, and several rolled-up documents secured with brittle rubber bands. She carefully unrolled the largest sheet across an old workbench. It was the original blueprint of the house. Although the paper had yellowed with age, the layout was still easy to read. Emily followed the basement floor plan with her finger until she reached the section directly in front of her. According to the blueprint, there was another room beyond the wall. Not a closet, not a crawl space. A fully enclosed room with its own entrance. She checked the drawing again, believing she had misunderstood it, but the measurements confirmed the same impossible truth. The house had been designed with an additional room that no longer appeared to exist. Somehow, at some point, someone had sealed it completely. Emily's mind raced through every possible explanation. Perhaps the previous owners had closed off the room during renovations. Maybe structural damage had forced them to abandon it. Yet if that were true, why had Ryan never mentioned it? Why had he insisted the basement contained nothing except old furniture? Why did he always lock the door? As she folded the blueprint, her flashlight slipped from her hand and struck the concrete floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the basement, and almost instantly, 3 slow knocks answered from the other side of the wall. Emily felt every hair on her arm stand up. This time there could be no mistake. The response had come from inside the hidden space shown on the blueprint. Someone, or something, was on the other side, barely able to breathe. She pressed her ear against the cold concrete. For several seconds there was only silence. Then she heard the faintest whisper, so soft it was almost impossible to distinguish from the wind outside. She couldn't understand a single word, but one thing became painfully clear. Whatever was hidden behind that wall was not empty, and Ryan had known about it all along. Emily barely moved. Her ear remained pressed against the cold concrete wall while every instinct urged her to run upstairs, lock the front door, and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, she stayed where she was, listening with a mixture of fear and determination. Several seconds passed without another sound. The whisper had disappeared, leaving only the steady hum of the furnace and the pounding of her own heartbeat. She stepped back and stared once more at the faded blueprint spread across the workbench. The measurements refused to lie. There was nearly 12 feet of unaccounted space hidden behind the wall. As an interior designer, she had spent years studying floor plans and room dimensions. She knew when something didn't add up. This wasn't a drafting mistake or an old construction error. Someone had intentionally removed an entire room from the visible layout of the basement. The question that now consumed her wasn't whether the room existed. It was why someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to make sure nobody ever found it. And perhaps even more unsettling was another question she could no longer ignore. If Ryan knew about this hidden space, why had he spent 8 years making certain she never discovered it? Unable to wait until morning, Emily carried the blueprint upstairs and opened her laptop. She searched county property records, historical building permits, and archived newspaper articles connected to the address. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The house had changed ownership several times over the decades, passing from one family to another without attracting much attention. Then she found something odd. Renovation permits from nearly 30 years earlier described structural modifications to the basement, yet the accompanying inspection reports were missing from the public record. Instead of detailed documents, there was only a short notation stating that the project had been completed under special authorization. Emily searched further, eventually finding a decades-old newspaper clipping mentioning the disappearance of the elderly homeowner who had lived in the property before it was sold. Authorities had concluded he likely wandered away while suffering from dementia, but his body was never found. The article made no mention of the basement or any hidden room, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the missing homeowner and the concealed space beneath her feet were somehow connected. The deeper she searched, the more she realized that every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. The following afternoon, unable to concentrate on work, Emily returned to the basement, determined to inspect every inch of the wall. She measured the room, carefully using a tape measure from Ryan's toolbox, comparing each number against the original blueprint. The missing space was exactly where the plans indicated. Running her hands slowly across the concrete, she noticed faint scratches near an old wooden shelving unit that had probably remained untouched for years. Curious, she began removing boxes one by one until the shelving stood completely exposed. As she pushed it slightly to one side, something metallic caught the beam of her flashlight. Hidden behind a shelf was an old iron lever almost completely covered by layers of paint and dust. It blended so naturally into the wall that no one would have noticed it without moving the shelf first. Emily hesitated. Every warning in her mind told her to stop. She considered calling Ryan, then immediately dismissed the idea. If he truly knew about this place, asking him would almost certainly mean losing her only chance to uncover the truth before he could hide it again. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped both hands around the cold metal handle and pulled with all her strength. At first, nothing happened. Then a deep grinding sound echoed through the basement as gears hidden somewhere inside the wall slowly came to life. Dust drifted from the ceiling while the concrete section in front of her began sliding sideways only a few inches at a time. A rush of stale, icy air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying a smell unlike anything Emily had encountered before. It wasn't simply the odor of an abandoned room. It smelled as though the space had remained sealed for years while still somehow being used. As the opening widened, the beam from her flashlight revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness beneath the house. The steps were clean. There were no thick layers of dust, no spider webs stretching across the entrance, No signs that the passage had been forgotten. Someone had been walking those stairs. Recently, Emily's hands trembled as she pointed the flashlight downward. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On one of the lower steps was a fresh, muddy footprint, still clearly visible despite the dry concrete around it. Ryan was supposed to be hundreds of miles away at a business conference. Yet someone had been inside the hidden room not long before she opened the wall. Holding her breath, Emily took her first step into the darkness, unaware that what waited below would change her life forever. Emily gripped the flashlight so tightly her fingers began to ache as she slowly descended the narrow staircase. Every step echoed through the enclosed passage, yet beneath those echoes she noticed something even more unsettling. The air wasn't stale enough for a room that had supposedly remained sealed for decades. Instead, it carried the faint scent of fresh coffee, laundry detergent, and clean air, as though someone had been living there only hours before. The muddy footprint she'd seen on the stairs wasn't an isolated clue. As her flashlight swept downward, she spotted several more prints leading deeper into the darkness. They were clear enough to show different tread patterns, suggesting more than one pair of shoes had walked this path. By the time she reached the bottom, she realized the hidden space was far larger than the blueprint had suggested. This wasn't a forgotten storage room. It was an entire underground living area, carefully concealed behind the basement wall. The lights suddenly flickered on without Emily touching a switch, triggered by a motion sensor somewhere above her. She instinctively stepped backward, her pulse racing. Whoever had built this place hadn't abandoned it. They had modernized it. The room looked nothing like the neglected basement above. A neatly made bed stood against one wall. A compact refrigerator hummed quietly beside a small wooden table. Shelves held canned food, bottled water, first aid supplies, batteries, and neatly folded blankets. An air purifier operated silently in one corner, explaining why the room felt surprisingly fresh despite being hidden underground. Mounted high near the ceiling were several security camera monitors. Most displayed blank screens, but one still showed a live image of the basement staircase Emily had just ascended. Someone had installed a surveillance system powerful enough to monitor anyone entering or leaving the hidden room. Emily's heart pounded as she realized whoever used this place always knew when someone was coming. On the desk beneath the monitors lay several notebooks filled with handwritten dates, receipts from nearby grocery stores, maps of surrounding neighborhoods, and folders containing newspaper clippings spanning nearly 20 years. None of it appeared random. Everything had been carefully organized, almost like evidence collected during a long-running investigation. Yet there wasn't a single page explaining who had gathered it or why. Then Emily noticed something that made her stop breathing for a moment. Along the far wall hung dozens of framed photographs. At first she assumed they belonged to previous homeowners, but as she stepped closer, the truth slowly emerged. Every photograph featured her, though she was carrying groceries into the house, sitting alone in a coffee shop reading a book, walking her dog through the neighborhood park years before she had even met Ryan. One photograph showed her leaving the apartment where she had lived in another state nearly a decade earlier. Another captured her talking with a coworker outside her first design studio. These weren't pictures taken after their marriage. Some had been taken years before Ryan had ever introduced himself to her. Emily counted them one by one until she lost track somewhere past 50. Whoever had assembled this collection had followed her long before she knew they existed. Her knees weakened as a terrifying possibility entered her mind. Had Ryan been watching her before they met? Had every chance encounter, every first conversation, every romantic coincidence been carefully planned from the beginning? The marriage she believed had started with love suddenly felt like something entirely different. As Emily struggled to process what she was seeing, another object caught her attention on a nearby shelf. It was an old leather photo album covered in dust. Inside were pictures of Ryan from nearly 15 years earlier, but something was different. He looked younger, of course, yet the woman standing beside him made Emily's hands begin to tremble uncontrollably. She had the same shoulder-length brown hair, the same bright smile, the same small birthmark near her left wrist. She looked so much like Emily that, at first glance, they could have been sisters. Written beneath one faded photograph were the words, "Summer, 2011. Emily stared at the image, trying desperately to remember whether Ryan had ever mentioned this woman. He never had. As she turned another page, she found a newspaper clipping tucked inside the album. The headline reported the disappearance of a young woman whose name had never been publicly connected to Ryan. According to the article, she had vanished without explanation, leaving investigators with no suspects and no clear evidence of what had happened. Emily slowly looked back and forth between the missing woman's photograph and her own reflection in the glass covering the frame. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. A cold realization settled over her. Perhaps Ryan hadn't fallen in love with her because of who she was. Perhaps he had chosen her because she reminded him of someone who had disappeared years earlier. And just as that thought crossed her mind, one of the security monitors flickered. A car was pulling into the driveway above. Ryan had come home a full day earlier than expected. Emily's eyes locked onto the security monitor as Ryan's black SUV rolled slowly into the driveway. For several seconds, she couldn't move. According to the itinerary he had shown her before leaving, he wasn't supposed to return until the following evening. Yet there he was, stepping out of the vehicle with the same calm expression he always wore. He wasn't carrying luggage. He wasn't talking on the phone. Instead, he looked directly toward the basement entrance, as though he already knew exactly where Emily was. Her breathing became shallow as she looked around the hidden room one last time. The photographs, the notebooks, the newspaper clipping about the missing woman, the surveillance monitors. None of it made sense anymore. Every explanation she had tried to convince herself of had fallen apart. She quietly climbed the staircase, leaving everything exactly as she had found it except for the old photograph. She instinctively slipped into her jacket pocket. When she reached the basement, she pushed the concealed wall closed with trembling hands. The grinding mechanism disappeared behind the shelving unit just seconds before she heard the back door open upstairs. Ryan called her name in his usual warm voice, asking if she was home. It sounded exactly the way it had every day for the past 8 years. Yet now every familiar word carried a weight she had never noticed before. Ryan found Emily standing in the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee she had poured only moments earlier to steady her shaking hands. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and apologized for returning earlier than expected, explaining that the conference had been canceled because of severe weather. Emily searched his face for any sign that he knew what she had discovered, but his expression remained remarkably composed. As they sat together at the dining table, Ryan spoke casually about traffic, canceled meetings, and plans for the weekend. Emily answered with short replies, careful not to reveal the panic building inside her. Then she asked a question that changed the entire conversation. Ryan, who was the woman in the photograph from 2011, his fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For the first time since she had known him, the color drained from his face. He didn't ask which photograph. He didn't pretend to be confused. Instead, he quietly placed his fork on the table and stared at the floor for several long seconds before saying something Emily never expected to hear. You opened the room. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The silence that followed seemed endless until Ryan slowly nodded and admitted there was no point hiding the truth any longer. What Ryan revealed over the next hour sounded almost impossible to believe, yet much of it could later be verified through public records and interviews with investigators familiar with the property's history. Years before meeting Emily, Ryan had been engaged to a woman named Claire, the same woman whose disappearance remained unsolved. Claire had vanished only weeks before their wedding. Despite years of investigation, authorities found no evidence proving she had been harmed or even left voluntarily. Ryan became the primary suspect simply because he had been the last known person to see her. Although detectives never found enough evidence to charge him, public suspicion destroyed his career, his friendships, and nearly every relationship in his life. Determined to prove his innocence, Ryan purchased Claire's childhood home years later after learning it had eventually been abandoned and sold. During renovations, he discovered the concealed room beneath the basement. Inside were journals, surveillance equipment, property records, and evidence suggesting someone had secretly observed several families living in the house over decades. Ryan became convinced the hidden room held the key to Claire's disappearance, so he transformed it into a private investigation center, collecting every document he could find while avoiding public attention because he feared no one would believe him. His mistake, he admitted with tears in his eyes, was keeping the entire investigation hidden from Emily. Every lie he told to protect the investigation slowly destroyed the trust he had worked so hard to build. Emily wanted to believe him, but one question still remained unanswered. Why were there dozens of photographs of her taken years before they met? Ryan looked genuinely shaken. He walked downstairs with Emily, reopened the hidden room, and searched frantically through the files until he located another folder buried beneath several boxes. Inside were photographs not only of Emily, but of several other women from different states, all sharing similar physical features. Notes beside the pictures were written in handwriting Ryan insisted was not his. As they examined the documents together, they realized someone had been watching these women long before Ryan ever purchased the property. The surveillance had begun years earlier under the previous owner, whose disappearance had never been solved. Ryan believed the hidden room had belonged to that man, who had secretly documented women resembling Claire for reasons investigators never uncovered. Before either of them could process the discovery, one of the security monitors suddenly activated. A live camera showed movement outside the basement door. Both of them stared in disbelief. Ryan was standing beside Emily. No one else should have been inside the house. Yet on the screen, the basement door slowly opened by itself, and a shadow moved across the camera before the signal abruptly went black. Police later searched the property from top to bottom. They recovered additional evidence hidden within the walls, but never identified the person who appeared on the recording. Some questions were finally answered. Others remain unanswered to this day. Emily eventually left the house forever, taking nothing except the old photograph she had found that first night. Years later, she would say the hidden room didn't destroy her marriage because of what was inside it. It destroyed her marriage because it proved that even after 8 years together, there were parts of the person she loved that remained completely hidden. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this. Somewhere, there may still be another hidden room waiting for someone else to hear 3 slow knocks behind the wall.